It is the afternoon of 28th of July, 1794, or by the revolutionary calendar, the 10th of Thermidor, year 2. In a cell deep inside the Conciergerie, the antechamber to the guillotine, a man lies on a wooden bed, narrow and flat like a coffin plank. His name is Maximilien Robespierre. Less than 2 months earlier, he stood at the height of his power, presiding over the festival of the Supreme Being. Some called him the high priest of a new moral republic. This 36-year-old lawyer from Arras had, over the past 5 years or so, become one of the best-known figures in the French government. Orphaned young and born to a modest family, Robespierre rose from provincial obscurity thanks to his eloquence, reputation for incorruptibility, and willingness to champion what he saw as just. Now, the same man is reduced to a broken figure. A pistol shot the night before, whether fired by himself or someone else, no one truly knows. It left him shattered and mute. His jaw is gone. The voice that once swayed a revolution can no longer form a single word. At 6 p.m., after formalities at the Revolutionary Tribunal, Robespierre is dragged onto a tumbrel along with 21 others. Some were friends, some were political allies, some were complete strangers. The cart rolls away from the Palais de Justice. The streets are packed. Robespierre sits slumped back against the sideboards, head wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. He doesn't move. The cart crawls through the crowd, taking nearly an hour to reach its final destination, the Place de la Révolution. The crowd that once cheered him now spits, curses, and laughs. A woman claws her way to the cart, gripping the rail, screaming into his ruined face. "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." His eyes remained closed. But when the cart halts outside Carpenter Duplay's house, where he had rented a modest room in the past years, he briefly opens them. His eyelids tremble, then close again. The cart moves on. It will soon be over. At the foot of the scaffold, he lies on the ground and watches others go before him. Couthon, twisted and pale, is among the first. His brother Auguste follows, body already broken from the night before. Saint-Just murmurs a farewell as he climbs the steps. Farewell indeed. The end is coming. The blade falls again and again. Blood darkens the wood. The scaffold reeks of iron. By some grim miracle, Robespierre manages to walk unaided to the scaffold. His steps are slow and unsteady, but his back remains straight. A shred of dignity, stubborn to the end. Just before they strap him down, the executioner yanks the bandage from his shattered jaw. The scream that follows is not quite human. A raw, animal scream of pure agony erupts from his throat. It is the last sound he will ever make. The blade drops, the crowd cheers, the incorruptible is dead. That marked the end of Maximilien Robespierre, and for most people, the end of the reign of terror. But what if I told you that the terror, as it is commonly portrayed, as a systematic state-sanctioned bloodbath orchestrated by one man, is one of history's most enduring political inventions? In this first of a series of videos dismantling persistent myths about the French Revolution, we will examine the man who became synonymous with this period in history, Maximilien Robespierre. Was this 36-year-old provincial lawyer a bloodthirsty tyrant or merely the easiest scapegoat? Was he truly the architect of the terror? And if not, why does this narrative still dominate today? I'm Amateur Voltaire, and today we will break all of this down. Let's start first with the terror. What exactly was the Reign of Terror? to understand the terror, you need to first understand the crisis that created it. By the spring of 1793, the French Republic was fighting for survival. It was at war with every single major power in Europe, and within its own borders, a brutal civil war was ravaging the Vendée region. Not only that, but cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux were rebelling against Paris. The economy was collapsing. In short, it was a complete and utter disaster. In this environment of panic, France's elected government, called the National Convention, granted extraordinary powers to a group of 12 men known as the Committee of Public Safety. Their mandate was simple and clear: save the revolution at all costs. For the next year, this committee governed France. This period, from mid-1793 to mid-1794, is what we'll refer to as the Terror for the purposes of this video. That being said, it's worth noting that both the name and time frame of the Terror remain controversial. Historians continue to debate what the Terror truly was and when it actually began. Like many aspects of historical study, really there's no clear-cut answer. However, for simplicity's sake, as I said before, in this video, we'll focus on 1793-1794, also known as Year 2, according to the revolutionary calendar. Before we go further, let's introduce the protagonist of our story, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre is a figure that has fascinated me for years. So it's quite difficult for me to condense the enormity of his character and his work in just a few minutes. Nevertheless, I will do my best. So, who is Maximilien Robespierre? Well, Maximilien Robespierre was born in Arras on May 6, 1758. He came from a family of legal professionals, essentially the white-collar middle class of pre-revolutionary France. His family had exercised various legal offices in Carvin, somewhere between Arras and Lille, since the late 17th century. At age 6, he unfortunately lost his mother, and his father abandoned him and his younger siblings shortly afterwards. He was raised by his maternal grandfather, and he had to act as the head of the family from a very, very young age. In short, he really didn't have an easy childhood. However, because he was academically gifted, at age 10, through the intervention of the Bishop of Arras, Robespierre received a scholarship to one of the best schools in the country, the Collège Louis-le-Grand in Paris. There, he studied from 1769 to 1781 and would end up meeting a lot of important figures in the future French Revolution. He was also recognized as one of the best students in his year, and he ended up receiving a lot of academic prizes before he got a law degree. After he got his law degree, he returned to Arras at age 23 in 1781. There he established his law practice, like his family before him. In Arras, he lived modestly with his sister and brother, and in his legal practice, he was consistently championing the underdog, putting social justice way above profit. Like his practice as a lawyer, his legal writings from the time also focused mainly on themes of innocence, of truth, and of people's rights. In 1788, France was broke, completely broke, and the king needed to raise taxes. To approve extra taxes, because he couldn't just put extra taxes out of nowhere, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, which was France's medieval representative assembly. It represented the three social classes in France: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. Everyone else was called the Third Estate. When the king announced the convocation of the Estates General in 1788, Robespierre entered the political arena. He was a candidate for the Third Estate. He published numerous pamphlets advocating for reform, condemning abuses, and calling for judicial revolution. Drawing on the theory that people have natural rights and also on Rousseau's principles, he argued passionately for citizens' rights. Fortunately, because of his local reputation, Robespierre did win the election and moved to Paris as a deputy for the Third Estate. Shortly after the estates met, because of a variety of very interesting reasons, the Third Estate ended up declaring itself the representative of the people and took the name of National Assembly. In this context, from summer 1789 to spring 1790, he emerged as a regular speaker in the National Assembly. He championed the restoration of civil liberties and advocated for a new political framework. His speeches attracted attention for their eloquence, precision, and authenticity. Although, to be fair, a lot of his colleagues viewed him merely as an ambitious upstart. Later on, when the National Assembly evolved into the National Constituent Assembly, which pledged to never disband unless they would give France a constitution, Robespierre built a reputation for firmness, energy, sincerity, and incorruptibility. He fought to limit the king's war-making powers. He exposed the contradiction between the theoretical openness of public office and the wealth requirements that effectively barred most citizens from serving. He also strongly opposed capital punishment and formally proposed its abolition. When the Constituent Assembly fulfilled its mission of giving France a constitution and turned into something called the Legislative Assembly, Robespierre initially hesitated to accept any further government office. In fact, he successfully advocated for a rule making outgoing deputies ineligible for re-election to prevent the concentration of power in individuals, and he applied this principle to himself as well. In June 1791, Robespierre was elected public accuser for the Parisian Criminal Court, a position he really did not enjoy much. Though he accepted this position, he resigned just 10 months later, according to him, to focus on his political work, which in retrospect is quite an interesting choice given that he really had no official position or really no income at the time. But while more or less unemployed, Robespierre founded and directed his own newspaper called The Defender of the Constitution. Anyway, for a variety of reasons that I really won't go into today, France declared war on Austria on the 20th of April, 1792. In his newspaper, Robespierre fiercely denounced the war and also denounced its supporters. He defended the freedom of the press. He also advocated for the rights of ordinary citizens, especially the right to exist and the right to resist oppression.
Tranquility is public order. It is social harmony. Can it exist without justice, without liberty, without happiness? Who are the ones who disturb it? Is it the tyrants who violate the rights of the people, or the people who reclaim them?
In September 1792, after the fall of the monarchy, he was elected as the first deputy from Paris to the National Convention. Not only that, he was also elected first of the 11 deputies from his home department, but he chose to represent Paris. In short, he was truly extremely popular. In the convention, Robespierre quickly positioned himself against the Girondins, who then held the majority and whom he quite rightly blamed for the war, denouncing them as self-serving. He also defended Paris's municipal government, seeing it as the legitimate representative of ordinary citizens. While opposing capital punishment in principle, Robespierre did support Louis XVI's execution because he saw it as necessary for national self-preservation. He also advocated for the creation of a revolutionary tribunal that could judge those who are suspected of working against the Republic. However, after the Girondins were forcibly removed from power, he called for mercy, and he was arguing that punishment should actually target only faction leaders rather than all their followers. In the convention, he also advocated that the right to basic sustenance took precedence over property rights. He also helped draft the Democratic Constitution of 1793 and championed universal public education. So if you remember what we were saying at the beginning of this video, by 1793, France was at war with everyone. So in response, the National Convention created the Committee of Public Safety, a committee of 12 people whose mandate was to manage the war effort and safeguard the Republic. Robespierre joined the committee in July 1793. At this point, years of overwork and anxiety had really undermined his health, Nevertheless, he accepted the appointment and immersed himself in various aspects of government operations. His main responsibility was supervising police work, arrests, and prisoner releases. Additionally, he also participated in several other areas, but a bit less. He worked in food supplies, in the war effort, issues in public morale, and he was also in charge of investigating conspiracies and involved himself in diplomatic relations. Perhaps his most two well-known initiatives in the last period of his life are his support for the controversial law of the 22 Prairial, which was a law that eliminated due process for accused people and also allowed the juries only to have the choice between acquitting the person or putting them to death. So not a very good law. And the second initiative that he had was his support of the cult of the Supreme Being. This cult was aiming to find a compromise between atheists and the majority of the population who are Catholic by offering a third rational option for worship, namely a spiritual practice which lacked a clergy or a sacred text. It was a promising idea, as in conceptually it was interesting, but it backfired spectacularly because people thought Robespierre was trying to make himself God. Being part of the committee was really a grueling affair, and it was mostly fueled by lack of sleep and copious amounts of coffee, not only for Robespierre, but for all its members. His naturally frail health and very strict lifestyle made him prone to illness, which often coincided with political crises. And during year 2, you had a lot of political crises. So this means that he experienced a lot of periods of sickness and withdrawal from the Committee of Public Safety. The stress of political conflicts, particularly his confrontations with former allies and friends in early 1794, took a lasting toll on both his physical and mental health. By June 1794, he was overwhelmed by constant accusations, assassination attempts, and public demands. So he largely withdrew from active participation in the Committee of Public Safety, and he only signed minor documents. Physically and politically exhausted, Robespierre delivered his final speech to the convention on July 26th. It's not a very good speech. It's a very disjointed speech. And in this disjointed mess, he attempted to defend himself against mounting accusations while simultaneously condemning certain government officials for abusing power and falsely using his name to justify a lot of oppressive acts. He was still in favor of revolutionary government, but he strongly denounced the excesses that came with the revolutionary government, especially by certain members of the convention. Fatally, he failed to specifically identify who he was intending to purge. This ambiguity proved really to be his undoing, because the vague threats left everyone in the convention feeling they might be targeted. So the convention turned against him, and in another disastrous session, he was arrested on the 27th of July. He and his political allies were initially freed and taken to the City Hall of Paris. Leaders of different Parisian sections attempted to organize a defense on his behalf, but they failed to rally the population to Robespierre's defense. Honestly, after 4 years of revolution, the people of Paris were simply exhausted. The convention rearrested him, and during his arrest, he was shot in the jaw. This is where we found him at the beginning of the video. He would be executed the following day with 21 of his allies. Every time when talking about year 2, the claim that Robespierre was the almighty dictator of France during the Terror inevitably comes up. Off the top of my head, I can name countless books and films where Maximilien Robespierre is portrayed as a lone tyrant, the uncrowned dictator of revolutionary France, who orchestrated a bloody rampage until his colleagues and the people finally rose up against him. But is it really true? Did the man who, throughout his entire career, did not seek governmental offices and generally steered clear of centralizing power in an individual, lose his mind and seek dictatorship? Well, let's look at the facts. First of all, what is a dictator? A dictator is an absolute ruler who concentrates power in themselves or in a small clique and is operating without the constraints of the law or genuine public consent and is actively suppressing any opposition. So, was Robespierre an absolute ruler who concentrated power in himself or a small clique? Well, it's rather easy to answer. Robespierre never held dictatorial power in any formal sense, nor did he rule France alone. He occupied no singular executive position. Rather, he served as just one of 12 members on the Committee of Public Safety. Plus, looking at the committee's actual decrees reveals he wasn't even its most active participant. The committee operated as a collective body. Often, there were fierce disagreements, and Robespierre's influence, while it was certainly significant, had clear limitations. Rather than being all-powerful, he regularly encountered direct opposition from fellow committee members. As we saw in his biography, he actually withdrew from the committee activities towards the end of his life, and he was requiring quite a bit of coaxing to resume his duties. We can confidently say that Robespierre did not concentrate power in himself. But was the Committee of Public Safety, the body where he was just one of 12, dictatorial? Well, we could make the case for that, but I think the evidence is not necessarily strong. The Committee of Public Safety did not really possess absolute power during this period or any other period. First of all, the committee was an elected body that was renewed by the National Convention every month. So while membership during year 2 was fairly stable, the convention still retained the power to dismiss the committee. Plus, executive authority was diffuse. The committee coordinated war strategy and policy, but another body, called the Committee of General Security, oversaw internal policing. Meanwhile, representatives on mission from the convention were traveling the provinces and were wielding substantial independent authority, and local surveillance committees were making arrests independently of what Paris was saying. So even at the height of revolutionary government, they needed approval from the convention, which voted on legislation, and they relied on representatives on mission who implemented policies in the provinces with, honestly, various levels of effectiveness. What is true, however, is that Robespierre wielded extraordinary influence as the revolution's moral tribune. And his personal network, particularly through the Jacobin Club, was extensive. Yet this influence should not be confused with omnipotence, because it really was not. Now, you might agree that Robespierre wasn't a dictator, but surely he masterminded the terror, right? Surely the bloodshed of 93-94, the guillotine executions, the trials and purges were all part of Robespierre's grand design, right? Surely Robespierre, the man who consistently spoke against the death penalty throughout his career, suddenly snapped and deliberately engineered the terror as a systematic policy of fear, right? Well, no. Why would he? No, really, why would he? We owe this narrative of Robespierre as the bloodthirsty monster primarily to the men who killed him. Just 1 month after Robespierre's death, this narrative took shape. On August 28, 1794, Deputy Jean Labartalian, one of the coup's leaders, delivered a crucial speech that formally and retroactively defined the terror as a system of government, Robespierre's government specifically. Tallien argued that while a revolutionary government remained necessary, Robespierre's oppressive system of terror must end. He drew a clear distinction between legitimate fear of the law and the destructive terror that served tyranny. Most importantly, Tallien portrayed the convention as a victim rather than an accomplice. This is what he says.
This system of terror was Robespierre's. It was he who put it into practice, with the help of a few subordinates, some of whom perished with him, others of whom are buried alive in public contempt. The Convention was a victim, never an accomplice. The nation and Europe blame Robespierre for the crimes that resulted, and they now give this infernal system the name of Robespierre. Public and private resentments are satisfied by the punishment of this monster and his accomplices.
Pamphlets and official reports quickly adopted the same language. System of oppression and terror, dreadful system of terror, firmly attributing its creation to Robespierre and his associates. By early 1795, official documents portrayed Robespierre as the monster who perverted the revolution, directly blaming him for orchestrating all revolutionary violence. The term Reign of Terror itself, with a capital T, became established during this period, particularly after anti-Jacobin writer Benjamin Constant published On the Effects of Terror in 1797. After this point, the idea that Robespierre had personally created the terror became widely accepted. But what's the reality? The idea that Robespierre authored the terror confuses cause and effect. Much of the violence during the period was reactive and improvised, emerging from local circumstances rather than central decisions from Paris. Not only that, but Robespierre only joined the Committee of Public Safety in July 1793, stepping into a process that was already well underway. The Revolutionary Tribunal, the primary engine of executions, was established in March 1793, months before Robespierre joined any executive body. The infamous laws like the Law of Suspects were committee initiatives that Robespierre supported, but so did most of the convention members. Far from being his personal creation, these harsh measures emerged from collective decision-making. In fact, examining the convention's records reveals no instance where Robespierre got up and proclaimed, "We hereby declare terror." On the contrary, when the term terror appeared in official context before mid-1794, it typically criticized excesses or called for justice tempered with virtue. Robespierre's famous speech of the 5th of February 1794, commonly cited as proof of his supposed devotion to terror, in fact says something completely different. In that speech, Robespierre made two critical points.
If the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, amid revolution, it is at the same time virtue and terror.
Robespierre argued that in normal times, a republic functions through civic virtue, so public spirit and devotion to the common good. But during a revolution, virtue alone becomes insufficient. A crisis requires an additional tool. That tool is terror. In his speech, he clarifies further.
Virtue without which terror is fatal. Terror without which virtue is impotent.
In other words, virtue without enforcement, namely terror, would allow enemies of the Republic to win. Terror without virtue would be brutality, lacking any moral guidance. Robespierre is insisting that the two, virtue and terror, must remain inseparable in revolutionary crisis. Terror guided by virtue, virtue protected by terror. He then, in the exact same speech, defines what he means by terror. And he says,
Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is not so much a special principle as it is a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most urgent needs.
For Robespierre, terror was not random or excessive violence, but the swift, firm application of justice in defense of the Republic. Terror was a tool, not an end in itself. I have read this speech countless times. It's perhaps, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating speeches Robespierre ever delivered. Honestly, I still fail to find any blueprint for indiscriminate violence in it. Don't get me wrong, Robespierre certainly endorsed harsh measures. For instance, he supported accelerating trials and broadening definitions of enemies in mid-1794. The law of Prairial wasn't a very good law, as I said before, but many of the worst atrocities of the terror happened without his knowledge or even against his wishes. The grisly drownings at Nantes, the infernal columns burning everything in the Vendée, the mass executions by cannon fire in Lyon, and many other atrocities were carried out by men who later played key roles in overthrowing Robespierre. Robespierre played no direct role in those atrocities. In several instances, he actually advocated for clemency when violence became excessive. By spring 1794, he publicly condemned ultra-radicals for their brutal actions, suggesting they were deliberately undermining the revolution's legitimacy. Rather than masterminding widespread terror throughout France, Robespierre frequently struggled to control what he perceived as reckless and counterproductive violence. So why the propaganda? This narrative of a ruthless dictator Robespierre who was on a mission to kill most of France was born in the political chaos that followed his downfall. The men who overthrew him in July 1794, later dubbed the Thermidorians, had a powerful incentive to portray him as a lone dictator. By attributing all abuses to his alleged personal ambition, they could conveniently wash their hands of all responsibility. Basically, it was his terror, not ours. By casting him as the sole architect, they absolved themselves of responsibility and portrayed the revolution as fundamentally sound, merely hijacked by one villain. Why? Why would they do this? Well, because when we examine those who orchestrated Robespierre's downfall more closely, we find not a principled opposition or coherent conspiracy, but a group whose own hands were thoroughly stained with blood. Therefore, it was in their interest to shift the blame onto someone else. Thermidorian pamphlets portrayed him as a would-be monarch seeking to establish a personal government. They circulated every single imaginable rumor: that he planned mass murder, that he considered himself a god, and even that he intended to marry the late king's daughter and crown himself king. This complete fabrication cemented Robespierre's reputation as not just a dictator, but a blood-crazed one. In reality, these accusations were grotesque lies, propaganda designed to ensure Robespierre, who was previously one of the most respected faces of the revolutionary government, would leave behind no sympathy or defenders. However, in the 21st century, we should know better. So why does this image of Robespierre as a bloodthirsty dictator persist? Well, the myth endures partially because of Robespierre's own personality. Stern, severe, and reputedly incorruptible, he fits the image of an architect of terror perfectly. People continue to debate his moral character. Was he a principled idealist or a dangerous fanatic? But that truly misses the point. This simplistic debate on a man's character obscures the true complexity of the matter, namely that the terror wasn't one man's creation. The evil dictator Robespierre trope persists precisely because it offers a convenient villain for a complex historical tragedy. It fits a familiar template: the lone tyrant controlling all events, like a king, or Napoleon, or Stalin. This creates a dramatically satisfying narrative: the noble revolution corrupted by one man's ambition. By portraying Robespierre as a lone villain, we overlook how collective government decisions and popular pressure fueled revolutionary violence. This simplistic view ignores how the revolutionary government, war, class conflict, and widespread paranoia came together to create the conditions for violence. It reduces a complicated historical lesson, namely revolutionary crises produce violent responses, into a simplistic moral fable: bad people cause terror. The portrait of a lone dictator, single-handedly orchestrating a reign of terror, is one of history's most successful and enduring political fabrications. It was a story crafted by the very men who had blood on their hands, a convenient lie to absolve an entire government of its shared responsibility for the violence of year 2. The reality is that Robespierre was neither an all-powerful dictator nor the mastermind behind the terror. He was one of 12 members on a collective governing body operating within a complex revolutionary government where power was diffuse and decisions were made collectively. The violence of year 2 emerged from wartime crisis, local circumstances, and collective panic, not from one man's blueprint of mass murder. The terror wasn't Robespierre's personal creation. It was the product of a revolutionary society under extreme circumstances, where collective decisions and popular pressures combined to create a deadly spiral of violence. I think that understanding that reality is far more valuable than maintaining comfortable myths about evil dictators. If today's video has sparked your interest in learning more about Robespierre beyond the myth, I have 2 excellent book recommendations. For French speakers, I highly recommend Robespierre by Herve Leuwers. Leuwers is a specialist in both the French Revolution and legal history, and I think he currently serves as the president of the Society of Robespierrist Studies. This biography was inspired by newly available archival resources, and it focuses quite a bit on Robespierre's early career as a lawyer in Arras. And I have a feeling this is the one that actually focuses most on that period of his life. Leuwers has a very methodical approach to historical analysis, which I really appreciate, and he traces anti-Robespierre propaganda from its Girondin origins through Thermidorian campaigns and also to its influence on later historiography. As I said, unlike other biographers, he focuses quite a bit of the book on Robespierre's pre-revolutionary years, which provides a lot of valuable context on his political development. In my opinion, the result is a very, very balanced portrait that avoids either idealizing him or demonizing him. So in short, it's a very nuanced perspective of Robespierre. For English speakers, you cannot go wrong with Robespierre, A Revolutionary Life by Peter McPhee, which offers an equally interesting perspective. McPhee's central thesis is basically trying to explain how could someone so principled and who embodied the revolutionary principles of 1789 so well come to be perceived as the embodiment of terror just 5 years later. Again, rather than portraying Robespierre as either a pathological monster or a tragic embodiment of revolutionary ideology, McPhee offers a third interpretation, namely that Robespierre was a fairly normal, highly intelligent, and ambitious human being who was shaped into what he was by the society and culture into which he was born. Like the Leuwers book, this one also focuses quite a bit on Robespierre's personal development and how his formative years in Arras shaped the young lawyer who ended up going to Versailles in 1789. McPhee shows a somewhat tragic figure, and Robespierre in this book comes across more slave than master to the events of the time. Both books share a crucial strength. They treat Robespierre as a human being, which I absolutely promise he was. Despite being born over 200 years ago, he was a human being. And both books acknowledge that. They examine their evidence carefully, acknowledge the limitations of their sources, and resist the temptation either to vilify or sanctify their subject, which I appreciate very, very much, because ultimately, this is what history should do. Not provide us with comfortable villains and heroes, but help us to understand the complex human realities of people living in extraordinary times. If you've made it to the end, thank you. And I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the myths surrounding Robespierre. I hope I will see you next time when we'll be talking about another persistent myth about the French Revolution, namely about the terror. Until then, remember to stay skeptical and don't take everything at face value. Bye-bye.